Hello, and welcome to Reveal's 2021 Masterclass webinar series. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Kelly, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar, Why an Agile Supply Chain is More Important Than a Resilient Supply Chain. Before we begin with today's session presented by Martin Rowan, I'd like to discuss what you can expect to see from us now through November. This webinar series focuses on supply chain and operational excellence in the new normal. But you're probably all asking yourself, well, what is the new normal? Over the course of the year, we're going to present on 4 topics that will help you establish this for your organization. After today, the next webinar will take place in May, the next following in August, and will be ending in November. And then as we get started with today's discussion, the webinar is going to last about 30 to 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer period at the end. Please capture your questions in the question or chat section during the presentation, but feel to raise your hand and be called out during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. We will record the webinar and it will be available on Reveal's website later under resources. At this time, I would like to introduce you to Martin Rowan, today's speaker. Martin is a managing partner with Reveal, and his primary focus is to facilitate solutions that help companies optimize their integrated supply chains to achieve a level of ERP maturity and increase profitability. He is actively involved with local and international supply chain markets and has been for over 20 years. His experience covers a wide variety of industries across multiple countries with specific focus on driving transformational change within the organization and the extended supply chain. Hi, Martin. I'd like to get you started.
Thank you, Kelly. Much appreciated. Thank you for that introduction. Today's topic around agility versus resilience is something that's come up very often in recent days, and been asked to talk quite frequently on this particular topic. So I'm pretty excited to get into it a little bit, specifically because when you think of resilience, it's used all over the news nowadays. Suddenly supply chains have become household names because of what we all experienced. But there's also agility, and typically both agility and resilience isn't necessarily synonymous with what you would think in SAP software terms. Often people have quite the opposite view on it. So I'm going to try and tie those back into your particular world and specifically how you could utilize SAP to be an improved supply chain. This is going to be our agenda for today, and touch on some of the impacts that the supply chain has experienced and show you some real life examples. We're also then going to really explore the concept of agility versus resilience and the benefits of both. And then, of course, specifically, it's all about so what, right? So what do we now need to do to become a more agile supply chain? And then we'll end off towards the end with some wrap up. We may have a couple polls throughout. So I asked that if Kelly pops up a poll that you participate, it'll just be super helpful for the particular conversation we're having. So let's start off with the impacts in the current supply chain. This invisible little virus has had quite an impact on all of our lives, personally, as well as business, especially for us supply chain professionals. And I think what it's done is more so than not, it's actually exposed the vulnerabilities of our supply chain to everybody. I think for those of us that live and breathe supply chain management and supply chain optimization efforts have always known that our supply chains are incredibly vulnerable. But I think that for the most part, companies haven't necessarily put the same priorities on supply chains. And so in recent times, we've actually seen a lot more chief of supply chain officers being appointed, and a lot more discussion is being had around our supply chains. So that's very encouraging. But the vulnerability was true. As soon as we realized we ran out of paper towels and water bottles and whatever else, it's extreme. And of course, in third world countries, the physical limitations are even more felt over there. The other thing that I think became really apparent to all of us is that we often think of our supply chain as our business, our little world. So from a customer demand through to what we're going to make, to what we're going to buy, and where we're going to store it, it's kind of our supply chain end to end. The reality is that we're just a cog in the larger wheel. So we're a micro supply chain within the macro supply chain. And when we start thinking about how our products go into other products that feed into other products that go to the consumer, or if we're on the consumer end, we have a whole bunch of supply chains behind us. That has become also important. The integration of these macro supply chains have really been stretched and strained to the point where we've been able to identify the need to have a more resilient and agile supply chain. The interesting thing, though, is that the common factor across all of that has got to do with inventory. I either have too much or too little. And being able to balance that, which is the old age challenge with supply chains, and then throughout COVID, it obviously was exacerbated some. And then we want to, the other thing I think that became apparent through this whole initiative, and we've done, by the way, a tremendous amount of assessments with organizations and had multiple conversations pre-COVID, during COVID, and now kind of towards the tail end of COVID. And companies have really started understanding, besides the need for a supply chain, but the difference between a good supply chain and a great supply chain. So I want to unpack that a little bit later as well, because that really drives to the heart of some of the things that we need to address. But in the midst of all of this, right, and at the heart of a supply chain, it's still the question of making sure that we find the right product at the right place at the right time. That need has not changed and most likely won't change. And as long as we have physicality and distance between us, there's always going to be this need to be able to balance how much I need to hold, where, and when. So let's look at some of the real examples of companies that have gone through. These are, like I said, reports pulled from organizations' SAP systems. You guys can go do that by running MC49 or MC.9, multiple transactions that give you these graphics. And by pulling this, we were able to very quickly see the ability to how finished products were moving, how semi-finished products were acting during this period of time, and of course, how it even impacted our raw materials. And you can see clearly from some of these graphs how the impact with COVID had a pretty profound impact, one way or the other, with regard to how we're handling, the specific COVID issues. Kelly, we have a poll right now, and it's really a basic question that I want to just kind of put out there to everybody to get a sense of what was their impact, how was their impact felt with regard to COVID.
So our poll is, who saw increased demand versus decreased demand during 2020 due to COVID? So we'll give you a couple seconds to go ahead and get that answered.
And while you're answering, those were kind of the two things that happened, right? Is that either demand dropped off the cliff and we suddenly had nobody's buying stuff that we were making, or we had quite the opposite. We felt it in our suppliers, we felt it on our customers. Our suppliers either had not enough inventory or they were running out and longer lead times started occurring. So there were multiple impacts, but it really had to do with those two front ends. How are we doing on the poll, Kelly?
All right, we're going to go ahead and close that poll, and it looks like we had a 50-50 increased demand and 50 on decreased demand.
Okay, that's amazing. I'm going to touch on some of the stories a little later of some of the companies that we worked with, and one in particular that comes to mind is a company called Minuteman, and they actually make physical cleaning equipment, but they also make cleaning chemicals. And obviously and you can imagine what happened is their cleaning equipment demand really slowed down, but the need for those cleaning chemicals increased significantly. And I'm going to speak specifically about them as an example because it's a real good one in terms of how they were able to adjust to both those examples using SAP effectively. Okay, thank you, Kelly. So what this does is that when we see these, either the drop off in demand or the sky rising in our demand, and it happens so rapidly, within our plans, we're going to see huge process deviation, right? A lot of like heavy efforts to try and keep up with those drastic changes, because these changes didn't come slowly, they came overnight. And so that caused a lot of process deviation, manual intervention, and the impacts that it has, if you start thinking of it from a systematic perspective, is if you look at some of your raw materials and you tie that back and you look at how a raw material plays into a particular planned order that needs to be produced to be able to meet a particular forecast or customer order. When you start looking at the internal network of that plant and those interdependencies of the bills of material, you can quickly see how the one impacts the other. And finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see how the bill of material for a particular finished good was impacted so significantly, with all the different exceptions happening and all the different delays and reschedules in and all of that had to happen. There was just a big kind of bullwhip effect within the plant itself. Now, if you're an organization that's multinational, or even just have multi-plans, you're going to have yourself be in a situation where you have a network. And often this network of plants across the globe or even locally, nationally, you'll find that when we have that bullwhip effect, the bullwhip effect not only is creating havoc within the plant itself, but it's also creating havoc within the network. And of course, the tendency for us as an organization is to deal with that, is to raise or use inventory as a buffer. How do I make sure that I can deal with this fluctuation and uncertainty? And usually that's a default back to inventory. Another buffer often used is lead times, but that has the implication on inventory anyway. Now, to give you an example of what some of the companies we worked with that we saw this from is when we looked at their particular network, you can again see how a particular product and one particular process order could have and its delay could have a massive impact on the network that was happening on the left-hand side. And so you can see how those networks were impacted just because of the challenges that they were facing within their interplant challenges. So I'm hoping that gave you a sense. I'm sure you felt a version of that somewhere, somehow. And obviously the response to that's going to be an interesting one to discuss further. Did we respond in a way that caused a lot of heartache and effort because we had to do so many things manually to get around, or were we able to use SAP effectively to kind of right the ship, if you want? Which kind of leads straight into the conversation around an agile versus a resilient supply chain. It starts off, and I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that became very clear to us was this notion that there's a good supply chain and then there's a great supply chain. You know, a good supply chain is I get my product for the most part out in time, as needed and as requested. A great supply chain has the ability to do that and more, and that and more means that it has the ability for us to not only meet those requirements, but be, I guess, agile enough to be able to address the specifics of the changing conditions, which leads us into the definition of these two things. We hear it on the news, we hear it on all kinds of webinars. We need a more resilient supply chain. We need to have more resiliency in our supply chain. The problem with resiliency in many ways, at the core of it, is that there's a redundancy that has to be built in that could be extremely costly. And it's only because of the definition, right? So if you think of resiliency, it's basically the ability for a substance or an object, or in our case, a supply chain, to bounce back to where it was. So we get hit by COVID, we have demand collapsing or demand rising. And so the idea is, are we able to come back to where we were, right? The problem with that is it takes time, it takes a tremendous amount of effort, and as I mentioned earlier, usually a lot of redundancy that could be incredibly costly. The flip side to that is agility. The ability for an organization to adjust to the changing circumstances fast and easy, making small and quick adjustments, or if you want, course corrections, failing fast and succeeding fast, but making incremental changes continuously. Now, I want to be clear on this. Agility is different than flexibility. Often we'll hear companies like, we need to be flexible. We want SAP to be more flexible. We want the flexibility is more of an individual need. I need the flexibility to be able to do X, Y, Z in my job. I need the flexibility to do A, B, C. It's about a change for me personally. Agility is at a wider scope. It talks about how can I, as an organization, with the entire end-to-end process, be more agile based on circumstances. And so I want to be clear. So flexibility and agility are not the same thing. We're going to focus on agility specifically because that's got to do with how do we be more agile as an organization to dealing with this. Because last year was a pandemic plus a whole bunch of hurricanes. This year could be wildfires and a whole bunch of other things. So there's always going to be some form of supply chain disruption that we need to address. And agility is what is at the core of it. So then the question is how can we get SAP to help us with that? So let's start off by just kind of thinking about the implications of not having agility in an organization. And if you think of this illustration, if you follow Reveal, you've probably seen it before. It's an explanation of a typical organization. You have a service level at the bottom that you're trying to meet a certain customer expectation. And then there's a cost of my business to do that. And that cost is balanced between either my inventory that I need to make, buy, or sell, and also my processes and my organizational, my systems and my people on the left-hand side. And so this cost, this whole process performance side versus inventory is what I'm trying to manage. When a pandemic hits and suddenly we're stocking out, or the flip side, the pressure has to go somewhere. And typically the pressure, because it's a closed system as a business, we're a closed system, it will then move over to process performance. And then suddenly we have a whole bunch of instability, a whole bunch of unpredictability, probably a tremendous amount of manual intervention, and very difficult to scale that, right? There's a proliferation of spreadsheets and communications and emails going around. If we were an agile organization, we'd have the ability to push back on the process side, make the tweaks necessary in the data, in the system, and in our decision making to find a more common level that allows us to meet those inventory levels that we need to be able to meet those changes. Now, obviously, there are physical constraints as well. For instance, my supplier may go out of business. So there are some real constraints when it comes to pandemics and big challenges. But I'm specifically talking about, challenges that we can control, right? Okay, so by defining it that way, we now know that as part of our big organizational drive for at least 2021 should be less about trying to be resilient, but really start focusing how do we become an agile supply chain. And specifically, how can we get SAP technology to get us there? This journey starts off with some fundamentals that I'm going to work through with you. And we'll have another poll at some point to kind of catch up on this. But this is at the heart of it, because, and frankly, this journey has been a challenge for supply chains 10 plus years ago, right? People really struggle to get themselves to this agility. The pandemic, if anything, has really just heightened the need for that. So I'm going to break it into kind of like these three buckets, if you want. One is we need to get to the point where we're actually utilizing SAP. And what I mean by that is that I would say probably 80% of the organizations we work with and that we do assessments for have a proliferation of either spreadsheets or third-party tools that are either plugged in or sometimes not even integrated that they use to make a whole bunch of process decisions and business decisions. And what it does is it drops the utilization of SAP's integrated capability to such a low level of maturity that it really doesn't do much for them anymore. At the end of the day, all it is a record-keeping tool. So we need to get out of that mindset. So the first step is utilizing SAP. The second step that we want to address, and that is then to take it to an optimal state. So if we're using it, how do we optimize it? How do we optimize the processes? How do we optimize the talent using it? How do we optimize the data? I'm not talking about database optimization. I'm talking about the functional use of SAP. And then when we get our handle on that, we have the ability to move into the state of maximizing the technology. So to accelerate our agility. So how do we then start capitalizing on the technology that exists? So let's kind of take it one step at a time and work through the different things. And I called this out earlier with the spreadsheet. I've used this picture in particular for many times because it has such a, I think everybody can symbolize or empathize with one or two of these faces when it comes to SAP sometimes. And let's be clear, it has absolutely nothing to do with SAP, the technology. It's an incredibly powerful tool, especially with some of the newer features and functionalities it have. It is just the lack of knowledge and understanding that we have as an organization that makes us feel this way. And when you suddenly place in a situation where the pandemic hits, my ability to be able to use the data to make good decisions becomes even heightened in its need. And therefore, when we're unable to get the data, the frustration mounts. One of the things that I would argue as to why people feel this way and find themselves in this position is that because they haven't truly considered SAP as an asset. And I mean that, and I used this term a year ago, and actually pre-COVID, interesting enough, around this notion that SAP is like buying a piece of equipment in your manufacturing facility, and then only utilizing 20% of its capability or capacity. It's a wasted asset or a wasted utilization, and a lot of it's got to do with this notion. One is that often it's implemented for financial reasons and then kind of given to the operational supply chain guys as a secondary thought. It's also often thought of just as a tool. It's just there to do, capture my documents. It's very restrictive. It's not quote unquote flexible. It's hard work. I'm doing all this extra work outside of SAP to give this data to SAP. It becomes costly, which just means that we customize more, we use more third-party tools, we use more spreadsheets. And so ultimately, it creates a mindset within the organization that it's not an asset, but really somewhat, in some cases, a bit of a liability. Actually, an interesting research that was done, and this actually mimics our personal research, is that about 90% of SAP customers out there haven't truly fully utilized the extent of functionality that SAP offers from the implementations. And that actually plays into this notion that it's got to do with this implementation trap that we all find ourselves in. Now, by the way, this implementation trap is true if you implemented 2 years ago, it's true if you implemented 20 years ago, and it's true if you implemented 5 years ago. It has always existed and continues to exist. And it all boils down to the measure of success for an implementation is typically on the basis that the transactions work. When I put it in and go live, my measure of success is the data is converted, is transferred over successfully, the system's up and running, the transactions are working, I can ship my product out the door, right? It's transactional focused. Besides the fact that 182% of projects are over cost and 230% are over schedule, that's almost to the extent, almost irrelevant to the fact that we got the transactions to work. It's very much a return on investment mindset versus a return on asset mindset. A return on investment says I spent $10 million implementing it, show me the benefit. And it could be found in simplifying IT platforms, minimizing multiple softwares, etc. But as a return of asset is, I want to be able to see that this asset is being sweat to improve my business outcomes. And that's often missed throughout this. And of course, what happens then is because of this mindset of not owning it to the extent, or just because the transactions are what they are and I just got to do my job around it. We tend to start letting it go a little bit. It's kind of the old adage of, if I don't take care of the oil in my car, at some point it's going to get dirty and it's probably going to seize up the engine. And that's true for SAP too. If we don't understand that SAP is a German system and requires German discipline, we need to maintain the cleanliness of our data and the importance of that. By the way, as a side note, when you move to S/4HANA and MRP is running live, and you move to any kind of AI or machine learning or any other technology, it's all data dependent. And if it's not working off of real-time data, none of those features and functions are going to work. So as a priority, cleaning up our house, if you will, making sure that all of the documents are relevant, is at the core of us being able to utilize SAP to its fullest. Then I would say the second component of utilizing SAP effectively is being able to cross-functionally work in an integrated way by managing by exception. What I mean by that is SAP was and is designed to be an integrated system. Our organizations are designed and built to be siloed. We have functional departments that do certain things. SAP is blind to those departments, blind to those boundaries. And so when data is flowing left and right, it's assuming that there's an integration happening at the human level as well. And that's usually not the case. So breaking down those silos, using a single source of truth, looking at the exceptions that are occurring and reacting together to get there is, again, at the core of getting us to start using the tool as expected. Now, if we don't do that, we find ourselves in a situation where our organization has got a whole bunch of rocks in it. A lot of expediting going on, all the working in our silos, we're overbuying, we have late shipments, we're below safety stock, we have data integrity issues, we have overdue deliveries, we are on time in full issues, we have processed problems that we deal with. And our natural response to this, as an organization, as a supply chain, pre, during, or post-COVID, and of course COVID, these rocks are even larger, right? You can imagine what is going on. Our typical approach is to put a water level above those rocks, is to kind of cover it up with inventory. And like I said, with the whole pandemic, we found that those rocks were even larger than what was normally the case with these situations. So when we're utilizing SAP, our core focus is going to be around not to try and reduce inventories, because you can't reduce inventories with these rocks the way they are right now. The core is going to be is utilizing SAP to start getting those rocks to reduce, which kind of leads perfectly into optimizing SAP and utilizing it more effectively. So what that means, in illustration to the words I just used, is if we're able to kind of reduce those rocks in SAP and in our process, we will naturally be able to hold less inventory. It's just a natural outcome of that. Now, again, this doesn't solve for suppliers that go out of business. Hence, there's a component of resiliency needed when we need some redundancy. However, if that happens, our ability to adjust the whole organization to meet the new changes in demand or capabilities is critical. And you can really only do that when you have just real-time rocks to deal with. If your rocks are 10,000 exceptions or 20,000 exceptions throughout your supply chain, it's overwhelming and we'll never get to it. And so we ignore it, and our inventories will continue to maintain at high level. And when we have higher inventory levels, we're not getting the return on asset, i.e. SAP's implementation, as expected. So it all kind of ties back to the notion of being able to utilize SAP effectively. One of the first things you can do as an organization is to group and prioritize your data and specifically your material usage. When you're able to do that, you have a much better chance in being managing more effectively the way the information in SAP, and then you can optimize each one specifically to optimize your supply chain. And obviously with optimization comes agility. So let's talk a bit about this for a second. Use this analogy. When you think of your fridge and you think of the different things you buy for it, you might be a coffee drinker and drink cream, add creamer every day to it. You consume it every day, maybe multiple times a day. So every time you're at the grocery store, you're going to buy it, right? It's just one of those things you're going to make sure you always have some of it. When you have eggs, you may only eat a handful a week, and therefore you get to a point where you may only get around to buying more when you get to the point where you're at a level that requires further more eggs. You may have some chilled white wine that is needed on demand for a big date or some kind of celebration. And finally, if the light bulb goes out in your fridge or in your plant, something breaks, you got to be able to go out and buy it when you need it. And so each of these become different optimization strategies that you can apply to your organization to start optimizing your supply chain. So when I'm a creamer guy, I'm going to continually make that product. It's a run-of-the-mill product I always want to make sure I'm making. I sell it all the time. There's others that are on reorder point. Some are make to order, some are unplanned purchases. By utilizing SAP effectively, and there's many tools to do that in SAP, at an S&OP level with IBP, all the way down to the actual tactical execution of the materials, you can group these materials to a point in like materials to be able to manage an optimal master data settings to give you these different results. This is critical to becoming an optimal supply chain and also being able to become agile. And then their impact's felt throughout, right? Because remember, this is an integrated system with a bill of material that is blind to any silos. And so when you start breaking down the various components, you can have reorder point raw materials that play into one that's working off of a PD, that play into a different semi-finished product that is waiting for demand from a make to, let's say we'll call it assemble to order finished good. And then comparing that to the consumption patterns actually allows SAP to make adjustments to coverages that need, like range of coverage or through coverage profiles, can use consumption related data to actually help predict and respond to changes in demand to make sure I only hold enough of that material in the particular network. So having the ability to group and prioritize, deciding not to have one size fits all and really critically think about each grouping and allows you to start creating optimal changes. Now, let's use the agility example in this particular case. If the demand changes on my end product, it will immediately be seen in my consumption patterns. It will immediately start showing me exceptions to my semi-finished that either I need to increase or decrease the pace on those demand changes, which will have an impact based on the MRP settings and planning strategies on each of the different raw materials and other semi-finished products in terms of whether I need to delay purchases, increase purchases or expedite them, or change my different inventory holdings closer to points of interest, because all of those master data settings will actually be connected to meeting that ultimate demand. Okay. Of course, at the heart of this, it requires knowing two things. One, how SAP thinks, and also two, how to then use SAP with knowing how it thinks to be able to meet those business outcomes. And it goes beyond training. One of the implementation trap pitfalls that I mentioned earlier is training. Often organizations will really only give a couple hours or a couple of days of training after go live. And any continuous education or training really comes from peer training. I learned from Sally, that learned from Max, how to do X, Y, or Z. So fundamentally, to move from utilizing SAP to the next step, which is optimizing SAP, education is key. So one of the big challenges I'll leave you with is figuring out what educational gaps exist in your organization that will allow you to kind of start utilizing SAP and start applying the right learnings to those processes so we can get some process improvement. The technology will follow the education and understanding of how it works. So big difference between the two. And a big takeaway is get your fundamentals and ongoing education in place. Which leads us perfectly into then, okay, so into maximizing SAP. So we've now utilized SAP more effectively. It's actually doing what it's supposed to do. We've now optimized it where we've challenged lead times, master data settings, different strategies, better network capabilities to be able to optimize the processes. And now we're at a point where we can say, well, what can we do with SAP and the future of SAP's technology to really accelerate the agility of my supply chain? So a couple things to note, though. Some recent Gartner research shows that two areas specifically in the business of supply chains that stands out is that more and more organizations are expecting to change their business models going forward due to not only the pandemic, but also due to the catalyst the pandemic has been for some of the digital changes that are expected. The second part of that, and maybe a subset of that, is most CEOs believe that the supply chain, digitization of supply chain is going to be a requirement of the future. And being able to trust the data, allow the data to drive business decisions, and be able to let data drive agility by making swift changes within the system to adjust to meet those business outcomes. So overarching, it's a trend that's not going away. And Kelly asked that question earlier when she said, what is the new normal? Gartner is starting to lay it out for us. I think we all knew it in our hearts and in our guts and what we've seen, but this is not only becoming more apparent, it is truly becoming the forefront of what most people are seeing in terms of their need for change. So SAP wisely or fortuitously moved to a much more digital mindset way before all of this started happening with the S/4HANA platform. And it's something that is going to provide us with the ability for all of us that run SAP to start being more agile through the use of some of the standard best practice features that SAP S/4HANA brings to the table. Obviously, there's cloud versions and on-prem versions, and this is not a talk about the best way to do S/4HANA. It's one of our webinars towards the end of the year. But this is more specifically around the fact that SAP actually had identified this need way before it became a real need. And now it's at a point where most organizations are really seriously considering this based on the previous statement I just made with the Gartner research. So it is critical for us to really explore what S/4HANA can do for us. In addition to that, SAP has been really pushing the envelope around becoming much more agile in their ability to provide us with more predictive tool sets, long-term planning tools around S&OP and IBP. So some of the capabilities that integrated business planning offer within the new S/4HANA space is truly going to be able to help us maximize SAP's capability and obviously the spend that we've had on this asset. But the possibility, so at the heart of it, the possibilities are quite endless, actually, right? I mean, if you think of the amount of data that is now being run by cloud-based solutions, and if you think of the size at which SAP's community has grown to over 440 odd customers worldwide, the possibility for organizations to capitalize on this investment of technology that SAP puts forward is immense, right? But there's a big if up there, right? And the if statement is if we understand we need to do things differently. We all know the definition of insanity. If we're going to try and implement any of the new technologies on the same basis we did back in the 90s, or even as early as the 2000s and 2010s, we are going to find ourselves in exactly the same place. because we've all heard this before. This time we'll do it differently. This time we'll stick to business rules and standards. This time we'll make sure our master is accurate. This time we'll educate and not just train our people. This time we'll leverage best practices and standard SAP. And unfortunately, those things, unless driven by leadership, strong organizational leadership, will be one of the Achilles heels again in a lot of the future movements to maximize SAP. So here's one way for you to establish where you are as an organization, and specifically to help you establish whether you're ready for the ability to maximize your organization's ability to be agile by using some of these improved technology in SAP. We call this the business maturity continuum. If you follow Reveal, you've seen it multiple times. It's at the core of what we do and what we believe. And there's 5 levels of maturity. And as an organization, you can actually run that little link below of that and go do a self-assessment, and you'll get a sense of where you are. But what I'd like to do, Kelly, if we can, is just run the poll right now and ask people, where do they think they sit on the 1 through 5 continuum? And I want to ask the question specifically around the fact that think of your organization as a whole, not necessarily one division over another, but specifically as a whole. Where do you believe you reside on this continuum?
Okay, I went ahead and launched that poll, and we'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and get your answers in.
And as you're doing that, I'll explain this as well for those that haven't heard this before. Level 1 means the system's doing what it's supposed to do. All the transactions work. And it's actually functionally integrated and technically working. Level 2 means that I have now a foundation of data that I trust that's coming out of this system that works. I have no old overdue documents. I have everything is real time and for the most part accurate. Level 3 means that I now have the ability to actually master my business rules so that I'm able to actually drive specific optimization mindset and optimization rules into my business to improve what's going on in my supply chain. So basically, make the rules reflect reality. 4 is in an optimal state, meaning I'm continuously optimizing and shortening lead times, reducing inventories, improving service levels. And 5 is my ability then to meet those objectives, business value objectives, continuously.
Okay,
so do you want to? Yes, please, Kelly.
There's a few more people that just came in, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And I'm going to share our results. So we have 44% between 1 and 2, 44% between 2 and 3, 11% between 3 and 4, and 0% between level 4 and 5.
Okay, thank you. That actually is very akin to a lot of the research we have found through working with companies. Thank you, Kelly. And in reality is if you're not truly going to be an agile supply chain until we reach 4 and 5. And only when we're in 4 and 5 can we really truly start utilizing the technology that SAP offers from a maximization perspective. So there's usually, if you think of the 44, 44, and 11 between the 1 through 3 range, you're talking close to what's that, 95, 96% is basically saying I am in that range that says I need foundational pieces in place. So if anything, you're still in, if you think of those 3 steps I mentioned, utilize, optimize, and maximize SAP, you're really still in the utilize and optimization quadrants. And so that becomes incredibly important. And what we have found anecdotally, that if organizations are in these different continuums, we find that the utilization of SAP is very low. So when you're on the lower end of 1 and 2, more likely you're not utilizing much of SAP's capability. And when I say capability, I'm talking about its planning capability, its rule-based capability, its exception monitoring capability. As you move into 4 and 5, you'll notice that companies that are agile are actually utilizing a significant amount of that functionality and actually getting the benefits for it. And what I want to do is kind of show you an example of a company that went through that. And I mentioned Minuteman earlier on to you guys, and this is an example of one of their examples of how they went through it. They had a situation where they had high process deviation, big swings in their materials, high average inventories, high dead stock, which is the inventory that's not turning, buffer stock if you want. And then there was a stage that said, okay, we now need to move through the utilize SAP component to the optimize component, which is in the middle there. Apologies that arrow's got the wrong title in it. Optimize, which you could see started reducing it. And then there was a point where they started maximizing the technology capability. And you can see how our inventories kind of followed suit in being able to maintain a more comprehensive level. But also, you'll notice this, the cycles were much smaller too, which meant they became much more agile and adjust. So for instance, if a shipment was late or got lost somehow, there was a shipment right on the heels of it so that there was a minimal delay enabled. That's the agility piece when you've got small cycles that you're producing in your supply chain. And Minuteman, not only were they able to do this prior to COVID, when COVID hit and they made that adjustment between chemical product versus cleaning equipment, they were able to adjust within weeks. They were able to turn up their production on the chemical side, cleaning chemical side, and slow down on the equipment side. And they did that all by adjusting the rules in SAP and allowing the organization to be incredibly agile and adjust to those results. So a fabulous story in the use of SAP and the capabilities that it has to offer to get us there. Okay, we're kind of in the tail end of the webinar. Let's kind of wrap it up quickly and then leave you with some additional resources. I think it became fairly apparent that having an agile supply chain is far better than just being resilient. If you're not resilient, at least get your resiliency. But obviously, agile, being able to adjust rapidly, is a much better position to be in. Changing the way you think, right? Thinking of SAP as an asset to be more agile becomes critical in that mindset, and kind of moving beyond just managing the transactions and moving to more of managing my business through managing the rules and the data. So 3 ways to get there. Step 1, look at that maturity continuum I showed you earlier, run the self-assessment test, and then if you know where you are as an organization, it'll help you establish kind of how far of SAP are you utilizing. The next step then is to say, okay, what can I put in place around education and some of the other components I mentioned earlier around to optimize your business and your SAP system. And then lastly, let's maximize this technology, this SAP that we have. And of course, always remember the definition of saying, let's not try and do it the old way and hope it's going to be different going forward into S/4HANA. As a reminder, our cycle of webinars are going to continue. The next one's going to be thrilling. It's going to be the top 5 things that you can actually do now in SAP. So I gave you kind of a sense of that, but we're going to get a lot more granular and our ability to show you how you can become more agile with the technology you have. And then we're going to touch on some of the others that are listed on the screen here for you. Any questions, Kelly?
I have 2 that came in through the chat here, and then if anybody else has questions, feel free to raise your hand and you can ask Martin directly. But the first question we have is, we have already embarked on this digital journey, but opted to do a lift and shift to S4. What do you suggest we do to take advantage of the S4 features to optimize our process?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because a lot of people have made the shift to S/4HANA already. Some even just implemented straight into S/4HANA. And whether it's IBP or S/4HANA or any of the new technologies that SAP offers, if you've gone that way, especially the lift and shift option, if you've just taken what you had and put it into a new technology, you most likely are still experiencing a lot of the symptoms that you had in ECC, which is, I may still not trust a lot of the data. My master data may still be messed up or basically 10 years old. I still may be seeing symptoms of business frustration in the user community, still a proliferation of spreadsheets, et cetera, et cetera. So because we didn't really do much around the foundational piece, we really just took the technology and gave it a new front. I would say that the first thing you need to do is if you're acknowledging or at least seeing the same symptoms, you almost want to just go back to the same model, which is how do I get to utilize the system more? How do I then get the organization to start optimizing it and then move to some of the newer technologies? And maybe because you're S4, maybe it's other things like machine learning or some blockchain stuff that can actually help accelerate some of that improvement. But you still got the fundamental first two steps. So if you look at that continuum again, those 5 levels, let's get through those first 3, even if you're in S4HANA, for you to be able to really maximize SAP technology. Otherwise, in many ways, you're just kind of accelerating the chaos a little bit, right? If you start moving to S4HANA, you're running MRP live, and even if you're doing DDMRP or any of these things, but you got bad data feeding into it, or old data, or people aren't sure what to do with it, it is going to produce bad results for you.
Thanks, Martin. The other question that came in is, in your opinion, what is the one thing we can do now to help our organization be more agile, a more agile supply chain?
Yeah, of all the things that was listed today and the countless that are to come still in the webinars that we can talk through, I would say at the heart of it, it is the increased knowledge of our business and user community. What we have found is that one of the biggest holdbacks is often not that IT doesn't know what good looks like, or that IT doesn't know what the best software solution may be. It is a lot got to do with whether the business, one, understands how SAP thinks, and 2, what to do to optimize or improve the technology and the processes by using the technology. And increasing that user knowledge is probably at the heart of all of this, because even when you move to S4HANA and you haven't really showed somebody how to truly run an automated PO process where you have almost frictionless touch points in a PO process, because you trust how MRP is producing the requirements against the procurement team, and you really focus on supplier negotiations and contract management, then S4HANA is not going to necessarily help you out. So that base education is super important. And I would say that at the heart, if you had to boil it down to one thing, I would say that would be the crux, is educating the user community and the workforce and raising their level of knowledge in the company.
Thanks, Martin. It looks like that was the last question that we have. And then if anyone thinks of any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help. And then also, if our next webinar takes place on May 19th, and that's going to be what are the 5 top things we can do now in SAP that will make us an agile supply chain. And that's going to be presented by Christy Bain. And then again, thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar will be available on our website at revealvalue.com under the resources tab. And you will find all of our previously recorded webinars, as well as some other informative content areas, white papers, success stories, and other helpful tips and tools. So feel free to take advantage of those. And we'll send out some information on the next webinar soon. So thank you again and have a good afternoon.